Hi guys, what is going on? And welcome back to another video on Conqueror's Blade. So today I want to kind of be dealing with attribute points, different classes, and a little bit about armor type as well. I've kind of covered attribute points in the past, but in a fairly sort of general sense, and I kind of wanted to dig into it a little bit deeper today. Plus, of course, it's been quite a while since I actually last did one, and a lot of new players have joined the game, so I think it's kind of worth doing a bit of a refresher on it and kind of see where we all are. So before we actually get into the attribute points themselves, I just want to very quickly cover the three armor types, which obviously, as I'm sure you're all aware, heavy armor, medium armor, and light armor. But it works differently one way than it does the other. So for example, if I currently open my inventory, you will see that I'm currently wearing Guardsman Heavy Armor, and I'm using a Glaive, which is, officially speaking, a Heavy Armor class. But despite the fact I'm wearing Heavy Armor, I can't then change to a Medium or a Light Armor class. So for example, I can't use a musket because that's a Medium Armor weapon. I can't use a spear, again a Medium Armor weapon, and I can't use a short bow. But it does go the other way round. So if I now switch to Light Armor, okay, that's some really crap light armor, but gives the picture perfectly. Then, of course, I can switch to a light armor class, which is the short bow. But I can also switch to the musket, which is a medium armor class. And actually, I can go back to my heavy armor, glaive. And if we look, I've still got the light armor equipped. So, light classes can only be played in light armor. Heavy armor classes can be played in heavy, medium or light armor, and medium armor classes can be medium or light armor. So that's why, even though the glaive is officially a heavy armor class, you can still have a medium armor glaive, because the armor situation goes one way, but it doesn't work in reverse. So that's kind of one thing I thought it was well worth clarifying before we get into some of the different build types that you can have in the game. So let's talk about then the 4 attribute points that there are available and kind of break down a little bit what they do. I think broadly speaking, I think of them in 3 separate categories. Initially, just to think about it, strength and agility, let's just clump them together into one. These represent increased damage. They represent increased piercing, slashing and blunt penetration and damage. But basically each one is the polar opposite of the other. So for example, with strength, you're doing that piercing penetration, and so because of that, you know agility is going to be piercing damage, which there we go, it confirms that it is. So basically whatever skill is represented in one is flipped for the other. So it basically means you have a choice of doing increased damage or increased penetration. And we'll kind of come on to them a little bit with some more specific examples later on. Then we have armor. Pretty straightforward. It gives you plus 3 points to armor for each value. Currently with this woeful armor equipped, let's go back to something half decent. Then basically this can mean you can become quite a tanky class. Generally speaking, you're only really going to be having heavy armor classes doing this. There are a few examples and a few builds where people do like to put some armor into medium armor classes, but generally, for my liking, if I'm going to go medium armor, I think you're sort of more about the damage, and I tend to generally avoid armor. It just tends to be, if I'm playing a heavy armor class, then I'm much more inclined to go armor. Although, in the case with the glaive at the moment, I haven't. I've got no points in armor at all. I'm all fully in strength. But previously, when I played them all, and previous to that, when I played the poleaxe, both of them I ran as full armor classes. And finally, we have toughness. This is basically constitution, hit points, life force, whatever you want to call it. It represents your maximum hit points. There's really not a lot of use for this. There's only 2 classes which it can kind of be viable, and that is Nadachi and Longsword. The Nadachi has a lot of abilities which make use of lifesteal, so if you've got a larger hit point pool in which to heal yourself into, it kind of works well in that situation. It can be a bit of a balancing act because you've obviously got to be stealing life quite quickly, but it does kind of work with an Nadachi. The Longsword works slightly different. It's not so much a life steal, but it has a self-heal. And the self-heal is a percentage of your total hit point pool, so it can work sometimes to have a bit of a toughness build based around the Longsword. But unless you're playing those 2 classes, then you can pretty much rule out toughness as an attribute point you're going to be wanting to use. So I'm not going to go through full detailed builds of every single class, otherwise this video is going to be half an hour long. But let's just break through a few specific examples and kind of work through how we reach the conclusions on each one and kind of what options are available to us. So let's start with the Nadachi, quite an interesting example in this case. So we've just unlocked the weapon, you've decided you want to go Nadachi, but you're not quite sure what your attribute point build is going to be. So first things I would do really with any class is head over to the skills. Let's have a look and think about what you're going to be using. You know, if you've got a bit of an idea what you're going to be using, you can have a look and look at the damage type each one's going to be doing. Okay, so that one's slashing. Okay, a stab, naturally, it's piercing. Slashing again. Slashing again. Let's have a look at some of the ultimates. Slashing and slashing. So it's clear that Nadachi is going to be a predominantly slashing based damage class. So you might factor that into some of your calculations. We know at the most, the Nadachi is going to be a medium armor class. So generally speaking, I think most people are going to rule out armor, or at the very least, you might only put a few points into it, because realistically, your armor value is always going to be fairly low. So I think you're better off focusing elsewhere. So if you're doing slashing, then we know if we go for strength, we're going to be getting slashing damage. And if we go for agility, we're going to be getting slashing armor penetration. We don't know exactly how these two compare to each other, but we do know in broad terms the main effects each one is going to have. So if you put all your points into strength, kind of like I have got here, then against sort of light armor users, medium armor users, you will find that it will be very effective. You'll be able to cut them down pretty effectively because all those points of slashing damage will apply relatively effectively, because your slashing damage will be really high, and even though your slashing armor penetration might be a bit lower because you've not got any points in agility, those light and medium armor users still aren't going to have the armor value to realistically protect themselves from your damage. So you'll find you do more damage against these light and medium users. But on the flip side, when you start to come up against some of the more heavy boys, the heavy armor users, those full armor poleaxes, you're going to have a hard time applying any serious damage. Whereas if you go the opposite and went, say, full agility and no points into strength, you will still do good damage against light and medium armor users, but you'll be losing that extra damage potential that you had if you had your points in strength. But the benefit of that is when you come against those more armoured heroes and those more armoured units you find on the battlefield, you're going to be able to apply a bit more damage because you've actually got sort of a decent amount of armour penetration to cut through that armour. So there's kind of a choice here. Some people prefer full strength, some people prefer full agility, or a 50-50 split between the two. If you really don't know, then I think you're probably a 50-50, you can't go too far wrong. But of course, as I said at the beginning, Nadachi is one of the few classes that has things like this bloodlust, this life drain effect, which is going to be able to heal and take health back to you when you stab and attack enemies. And the benefit of that, of course, is that you can continually prop your health up. Okay, that's not going to be very helpful in 1v1 PvP duels necessarily, but when you're fighting clusters of enemy units, you can put out as much damage as the enemy is actually going to be doing to you. You can basically be attacking enemy units, and as you're killing them, you're self-healing yourself. So having that larger hit point pool with the increased toughness is going to make that much easier to achieve. So that's a couple of viable builds. There's maybe 3 options with Nadachi, depending on how you want to play it. And that's something that you're going to have to kind of get used to, test and try, because there isn't necessarily one way to do it. There's definitely going to be some players who are going to tell you that every class has one fixed way and there's no alternative and this is how it has to be done. But it's very rarely the case. More often than not, there's a couple of viable options, and it depends what you want to do. Are you going to be playing mostly sieges? Are you going to be taking part in territory wars? Well, if you are, then you're probably not going to be playing Nadachi, but still, you get the idea. Your playstyle and what you want to do with the class is going to affect how you make use of it. But there are other examples where these things play out slightly differently, particularly around this strength and agility. So, for example, if I switch back now to my glaive, which is the weapon I'm primarily using at the moment, and then let's go and have a look at the skills, and we'll see things are actually slightly different. So, firstly, you may get the impression that some of the stuff is actually slashing based. Okay, slashing damage. Warlord's greeting, oh, that's more slashing damage. So you're going to be thinking maybe about how you're going to make use of this class in the sense of slashing damage. However, when you actually break it down, the 2 key abilities that I use in this class are Flying Reaper, but that's blunt damage, and shield breaker, which is also blunt damage. Okay, so there's an interesting thing about blunt damage, and that is that it largely ignores enemy armor points. So if we head back to our character now and take a look, then we'll see strength actually does blunt damage, whereas agility does blunt armor penetration. So we're no longer just considering the effects of slashing. So if it was just a slashing class, then we might be thinking a 50-50 split between strength and agility is the wise way to go. But when you now factor in that blunt damage, suddenly strength becomes a much more viable option to use, because we're getting this massive increase to blunt damage, and because that blunt damage pretty much ignores enemy armor anyway, we don't really want blunt armor penetration. We just want to make use of that maximum possible blunt damage. So for glaive, making use of strength is certainly going to be the way to go. Now I am naturally, generally, a heavier armor glaive. That means I'm using heavy armor. But plenty of people do run glaive with medium armor, because you get a buff to the amount of damage you do to increase that damage even more. But of course, you're becoming more fragile as you do that. I'm obviously effectively a halfway house, because you could also have a full armor glaive or a 50 strength, 50% armor glaive. So there's sort of a whole spectrum of high damage but quite fragile glaive, all the way up to really tanky but low damage glaive. There's multiple options on one single class, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to get across. You need to be making sure you take a look at the skills you're going to be using, think about how you're going to be using them, and think about what your playstyle is going to be like. Are you good at keeping yourself alive? For example, when I started playing this glaive, and you can actually go back and watch the videos that I talked through when I first started this a couple of months ago on this class, then I started basically and immediately went to a full armor glaive, because when I started as a full strength glaive, I just found I was getting myself killed left, right and centre. But the more I've played, the more I've got used to the class and used to handling it. I'm finding I can stun enemies a lot more effectively with my Warlord's Greeting now. I can keep myself out of danger that much more now. I'm much more familiar with the class. And so because of that, and because of my survivability is now naturally higher through dodging enemy attacks, I want that increased damage, which is why I've gone for this full strength. And I think if I had the suitable medium armor crafts, but I mean I've got leadership on these so I don't want to lose them. If I had the suitable armor crafts, then I think I may even go to medium armor with it. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of a better overview of how the attribute point system works, and how it's the case that there isn't necessarily just one viable build for your class, and there can be multiple. It's certainly going to vary based on your playstyle. But once you pick a weapon, certainly check out the skills, check out the damage type they do, and start to think about what attribute points that might work well with. If you're then still confused, feel free to ask for some more details in the comments down below, or feel free to perhaps pop over to the official Discord, the official Conqueror's Blade Discord, which I'll link in the description, and certainly ask over there, because it's certainly plenty of knowledgeable players who'll be able to give you a couple of different suggestions if you're still unsure. But hopefully this has at least given you the groundwork for understanding better how the attribute point system works in Conqueror's Blade, and kind of a little bit better of how that interacts with your skills, your damage, and your armor type. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys, and I shall see you all on the next video.